So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I Shamkant, I'm the partner OT and IT Cybersecurity. So today's webinar, I'm going to cover mega trends, challenges, and approaches from the Wipro's perspective. However, we have a Paul on the call who will be covering from the Microsoft's perspective. When we are talking about cybersecurity, right? So cybersecurity is almost focused discussion within the board meetings. When it comes from the OT cybersecurity, definitely it makes a more interest because there is a lot of things happening within the OT cybersecurity in terms of there are new threats that is coming up and industry is facing challenges. Now, considering Industry 4.0, we are actually experiencing the revolutions that each industry is going about Industry 4.0. When we say Industry 4.0, it's basically connectivities between IT and the OT. And IT being a legacy systems, it definitely it has its proprietary as well as the firmware which is not being considered or used when it is being developed, considering cybersecurity as an aspect, right? So what mega trends what we are seeing here in the industry is predominantly on the ransomware. So ransomware attacks are increased. And it is getting more sophisticated. What we have seen, the ransomware attacks, those were there, increased from 2000% from 2018 to 2020-21. In that one, there is an increase of the attacks from attacks in the manufacturing verticals. So 80% of the cybersecurity leaders are more worried about their ransomware attacks, how they and the threats happening to their industry predominantly about this ransomware attack, right? So what we are seeing basically, we are seeing that customers or the clients are asking more on the strategy, how these ransomware attacks needs to be mitigated or be managed. There are two groups what we've seen, right? As per the analysis, the two groups basically the two groups on the Conti and the Logbit. In that one, the 50% of the ransomware attacks are from these particular groups, and more on this is from predominantly in the manufacturing industry. So when we talked about strategy, there is no silver bullet on how do we mitigate. So there are multiple steps that need to be done to mitigate these attacks, and early detection is one, I would say, and out of that we can have a defender for IoT as a solutions that can definitely help in the early detection part to it. Now next is on supply chain risk specifically. So when we talk about chain, right, so it is strongest as well as the weakest chains. All cyber security leaders are getting stressed because of the recent Ukraine attack happening, as well as there is a cyber attack. Cyber war is there within this industry. And last year, industry has basically faced the challenges. The attack like Colonial Pipeline attack. Then there is an attack on JPS Food. There is an attack on SolarWinds. So these attacks gives an examples for us how we should be securing the supply chain, and it directly impacting to your downstream business customers as well as the end consumers. So there are many challenges when we talk about the supply chains perspective, right? So first challenge is predominantly that for cyber supply chain risk, there is no single ownership. It has multiple parties involved here. That starts from your legal team, your procurement team, as well as from the IT as well as the cloud team. So how do you actually ensure that there is a single ownership, and that is a major challenge when you talk about the supply chain risk perspective. Another aspect that business is now focusing to the operations team to move on to the cloud. The reason behind is that they want us to increase in their production, want to monitor the things at or do a data analytics, right? So while you do, how do you ensure, or what are those things that supply chains perspective you will be taking from the third party risk management processes, right? So these are the challenges that what we see is from the supply chain risk perspective. And there is an increase of the attacks from 44% to the 61% in the supply chain in this particular industry. So again, what we should be doing when you talk about supply chain, you must be knowing what are your assets, how they are connecting, where they are connecting, what are the risks associated with it. You should prioritize your risks accordingly. Again, I would say we can have a Defender for IoT as an example to start with, and to see what assets you have, and then you must be having the robust framework that comes that constitute basically people, process, and technology, right? And you must have the risk assessments. So we can help Wipros has a good risk assessment framework that definitely can help you in mitigating those things. Now, next about the regulatory compliances, right? So definitely, this industry is heavily regulated with the regulatory compliances, and each countries are actually bringing more regulatory part to it, refining their cybersecurity controls, reviewing and making more clearer, because they could see there is definitely need for it to ensure that the attacks those are happening in this particular environments are less, or there's a less impact to it. So the compliances like NIST CSA, ISO 62443, TSA pipeline, and if you look at each of these countries, right? So you would find all their they have the industry or the country specific compliances for your regulatory part to it. Another aspects what we have seen is predominantly in the skills perspective. Definitely, if you are seeing these attacks are happening, new regulatory compliances are there. So cybersecurity skills everywhere there is a scarcity is happening. Though you have a people, how do you see that those people have the proper understandings of your environment? To mitigate all this attack, you must have a proper skilled people, right? And there is a gap. Though a talent team is very good in retentions of those people, but you have to have identification of the gaps those are there between your employees, and ensure that those people are properly skilled, they have the proper certifications, and it's not just investing in the technology, but investing into the people is very much important. So I'm moving on to the challenges. So what we seen basically, we saw that there are trends, and what are the challenges? So these are the challenges that predominantly we have come across based on what we hear from our customers or the partners, as well as of the experiences, right? So these 5 challenges. First thing is about the cyber hygiene. IT security is very sophisticated, and we have a very good standards, policies, processes. When it comes from the OT cybersecurity, definitely there is a lack. What we hear from the customer is that most of their OT environment is managed by their vendors. So they don't know what exactly is happening at the ground, and definitely there is a need to have a proper governance and the policies to be defined. How do you do a patch management? As an example, there is a requirement to have the vulnerability management process to be defined. So there is a requirement to have security governance and define the policies for it. And main thing is about the processes. Then moving to the next challenge, what we've seen is about the lack of assets inventory. Based on the surveys, what we have seen is that there are 70% of the 70% and more than that, there is a lack of assets visibility within their environment. Unless you know what assets you have, you will not be able to manage your risk or create the risk management plan for you, right? So there is a requirement to have asset discovery, management of the vulnerabilities, as well as the connectivity of where it is connecting and what are your potential attack vectors or the surface that you have. So that is another aspect that the organizations are lagging over there. In terms of the connectivity or the segmentation aspects, what we seen is that most of the organizations claims that they have proper segregation between IT and the OT network, but in fact it is not, because there'll be a 60% of their entire OT network is being connected to the internet or to the external world. The reason behind is simple, because have uh, they have to give the access to the vendors, to their OEMs, to ensure that they are making their systems make up and available, or to perform the patch management. While this is happening, definitely there is a poor firewall rules, or the firewalls has not been managed or maintained properly. Then next challenge what we've seen is that about authentications part to it. Otherwise, or however, depends in the depth mechanism in terms of what are the controls that you should be having. So 40% of the organizations, what we seen, or there is a analysis report says that there is a account of the username password streaming happening between the IT and the OT world, right? So that is a major problem, and customers now looking for the solutions that can be used as multi-factor authentications, or any other way where we can use a passwordless authentication, but that will be a secured way. And finally, it's on doing OT IT integrated monitoring part to it, basically to have a secure view, right? So we have seen that there is no visibility into the IT SOC or in the OT SOC, what is happening at the OT environment. So there is a requirement to have a security monitoring aspects to it. So what we have come up with an ideal approach that every organization should follow or should refer to it. So this is again aligned with an NIST cybersecurity framework. So we have identify, detect, protect, respond, and recover. So identify, detect. So we generally recommend to our customers to have a risk assessment, right? So unless you know what is the risk you have, it is completely a risk-based approach basically. So to know what risks you have, you should have the assets. You must be knowing what assets you have, what types of assets you have, how many devices, what firmware, and the vulnerabilities out of it, right? Identify your risk posture and the risk appetite, because each industry, each plant is different, right? And you should be having the details about that. Once you complete or you do a risk assessment, definitely there'll be certain gaps, and those gaps needs to be filled in. Then next it goes to the detect, right? So in the detect part to it, right? So we can have you can review all your existing policies, procedures. You can define the roadmap. What is that roadmap of looks like for you? And then it goes for the architecture definition, which is in terms of the protect part to it, right? So once you define all your architecture, develop the strategies, whether you want to go with the cloud or you want to go with network segmentation. So there are different programs that can be initiated and that can be worked out. So that's predominantly will come from the protect perspective. And when it goes from the respond, we can have implementation of those solutions in various ways basically, right? So implementing solution is one way, technology it is one way, but how do we actually monitor it, right? So that's monitor, and how you ensuring that those implementation is correctly done, and there is no such challenges, right? I have a couple of examples I'm going to explain in the next slide about that. And finally, about the recovery. So this is the main pillar for you to ensure that you have a proper incident response management process in place. You have proper security analytics. We have seen most of the customers nowadays they're asking that, can you bring me a security analytics? I have a data, I have a data lake over here, right? I want to make an security analytics out of it in terms of what how many systems I have, how many systems those are patched, what how many vulnerabilities it has, right? So that is another aspects. And finally, it is makes sense to have the database or the configuration backup and restore. So you should have a periodic backup of the data as well as your configurations file, which is very much critical in terms of the attacks that you are suffering. Now on the how do we actually see or have a defense in depth strategy for you. So we have on your left hand side you have the Purdue model, which is from level 0 to level 4. I'd say 3.5 is the OT and the level 4 is for IT. And we have given the security controls as per level, right? So initially, yeah, we can have the physical security level, which is predominantly securing your entire premises. And then you, as you move up, right, there'll be different security controls that will be filled in. And an example, you can have a passive vulnerability scanning tools like Defender for IoT, which will be used to scan or discover the devices within the OT network. And you can have at various levels based on the visibility, how you would like to see the visibility within your OT network. Right. Then there is a strong recommendation to have endpoint protection. Firewall network segmentation is very much required to separate your IT/OT network, or within the OT network, you have to separate it out your engineering workstations as well as the production workstation. So you must have proper zones, and there should be a conduits between these particular zones. Another aspects I would like to emphasize is here is based on more on the OT Active Directory. As I told, there are 40%, 44% of the attacks that is because of the sharing credentials between IT and OT. So it's good to have a separate OT Active Directory so that you can have a user enroll and IT and OT, and definitely you can minimize the risk associated with this. And as move forward at top level, I would say it must be having centralized security monitoring center, or you must be collecting the logs that is coming from the all of these different devices from the networks to the centralized location. And can monitor. So you can have the Microsoft Defender for Sentinel for your monitoring purpose perspective. So when you implement all these controls, definitely there should be a review and the baselining or continuous improvement is required. It's not that you implement the control at one, but you have to validate, you have to verify those controls in a periodic manner. So this is what we suggest our customers to have a defense in depth strategy. I'll call upon Paul to talk about the Microsoft solutions in depth for OT and IoT security.
Yeah, thanks, Shyam. So following on from what Shyam said, we're just going to run through very quickly, looking at parts of the Defender for IoT solution. But the first thing I want to show is the fact that it's a family of platforms. So realistically, you have Defender for IoT within Azure. We can deploy this on-premise as well, but for the sake of this, I'm going to focus on the Azure solution. So at the very top level, we can see Defender for IoT sat within Azure. And once the data is within Azure, we can start using it in different ways. So we've got Microsoft Sentinel as the scene tool. We have the logic apps to provide some SOAR functionality. We can push the data into Power BI as well. So just having that data in a platform such as Azure gives you a lot of scope as to what you can then do with that data. But looking down at the on-premise element, the first part is in the brownfield environment. So this is the traditional OT environment with PLCs, RTUs, IEDs, all the other acronyms that are associated with OT. And that sensor collects data, it passes the data, it applies various kind of internal mechanisms to that data, and then pushes the information up into Azure. And we'll cover that bit off a little bit later. If we move across to the greenfield devices, so we're now getting into the more of the smart factory type environment. So the Defender for IoT sensor, the same as the brownfield, still applies because it's still applying that intelligence and that knowledge to what it's seeing. But we're now seeing smarter devices, devices that are running Linux or some kind of real-time operating system. So now we can put an agent onto those. And that's where the micro agent comes in. So that will sit on those intelligent devices down at kind of level 1, level 0. And it looks at what processes are running on the device. So it takes a benchmark. So the number of processes, the amount of CPU they're using, it works to stop any rogue processes starting or to control any processes in terms of those processes trying to take over too much of the resources. But as well, we're also looking at network connectivity. So who's connecting to that device? Who is that device connecting to? So we'll track that and we'll also control it. And that means that anything that happens out of the ordinary, so someone tries a new connection, someone tries to start a new process, it's going to be blocked, but it's also going to be reported back up to Azure. And then the last part, and this is kind of where we're starting to expand into the IT environment now, is looking at enterprise IoT devices. So the devices within your IT environment that you don't realize are there. And it could be something as simple as a VoIP handset, a printer, a smart TV. It could be a Raspberry Pi or one of those smart speakers that someone's bought in and plugged into the network. And we've got a few ways of getting that data. So Defender for Endpoint will push that data into Azure via the 365 portal around what devices are unmanaged and connected to the network. But also layering on top of that, we've got the enterprise IoT sensor, which will look at and understand what those devices are actually doing in the environment. So we're looking at covering as many areas of IoT as we can, both from the IT environment right the way down to the OT environment. So to connect a sensor into the network, and this is looking at the OT environment, you've got maybe it's not a traditional network in this case, but you've got a network where there's brownfield and greenfield devices sat within your network environment. So we look at deploying a sensor, and this can either be physical or virtual. So Microsoft are a software company. You download the ISO from Azure, and then you have a choice of hardware to deploy it on or a choice of hypervisor. And we push traffic from the network switch infrastructure into the sensor. Once the traffic's there, the sensor then starts using deep packet inspection. It applies behavior analytics. It applies the threat intelligence that's downloaded to the sensor. So it's looking for and trying to understand what's happening on the network. And then obviously, if you've got multiple sensors, you can push that data to Defender for IoT. And again, that can either be within the cloud, so within Azure, or you can deploy a local management console if you have an air-gapped network. But that will share information such as the assets, the threats, etc. But all of that information is available individually on the sensor. So if you just have a single sensor in place, you can just use the interface on the sensor to manage it. But ultimately, once we've got that data into Defender for IoT, we're churning through the information. We then want to integrate further up the chain with platforms such as Microsoft Sentinel, for example. But we can also push the data to other platforms such as ServiceNow. If you're using a legacy SIEM such as Splunk or QRadar, we can integrate with those as well. So that's really covering the deployment aspect and how it fits in the network. But now we're going to look at what does it actually give you. So the first thing is asset discovery. Now, some of these environments could be 15, 20, 25 years old, and a lot of the knowledge has probably left the company or just been forgotten over time. So the first thing we need to do is discover what's there. If you're trying to build a coherent security policy, you need to understand what it is you're trying to protect. But part of this asset discovery is also understanding, okay, we found a PLC, we want to know the vendor, we want to know the firmware, the hardware versions, etc. And we can pick that up using the OT analytics that we have on the platform. So we can give you that asset inventory of what have you got and what firmware and hardware it's running. We'll then look at understanding who those devices are connecting to. So we'll end up with a network map showing a PLC is connected to an HMI and an engineering workstation, for example. And we'll look to understand the protocols that are being used in that communication path. And we do that for a few reasons, or there's a few things you can get out of this. So the main one is to build a baseline. So these networks don't change. An IT network changes every time someone walks into the office or leaves the office by plugging their laptop in and then taking it home with them. An OT environment doesn't change. So we can map out the network to understand what you have, who is it talking to, and how is it communicating? And that won't change very much over time. So if we do see changes to that, that's going to be an alert. That's something that needs to be investigated. But also getting this information, and it goes back to something Shyam said around building up a segmentation policy. You can use that information to help you build that policy, or if you've got one in place already, you can use that information to validate that your segmentation policy is working properly. Now, once we've got this rich information around what assets you have in the environment, we can use that to understand what vulnerabilities are associated with them. So, for example, you may have a Siemens PLC running firmware version X, hardware version Y. Well, that PLC may not have been touched in many years, so there's probably going to be some vulnerabilities associated with it. Now, you can't just go out and upgrade the firmware. We know this. It's not an IT environment. There's no IT department telling you your machine's going to be blocked from the network unless you do the upgrade. We have to live with this for at least 6, maybe 12 months until the next change window. So once we've got this information and we can understand the vulnerabilities, we can also build up a picture of how vulnerable they are throughout the network. So looking at the connections that go in and out of that subnet, understanding what other devices are in the environment that are vulnerable, that we can take an action to remediate that risk. So having the tools on the platform to be able to do that allows you to increase your security posture without necessarily impacting the devices that you can't touch. And we're also listening for threats in the environment. So things like port scans, address scans, malware, internet connectivity, any kind of misbehavior that's generating a threat in the environment. We're looking to alert on that, and we're looking to give you the tools to be able to respond to it. And I mentioned that these devices or these networks don't change very much, but they will change over time. It will be a gradual process. But as devices get added, as devices get removed, chances are the rest of the network configuration hasn't taken that into account. So you're still likely to have devices that 10 years ago were talking to a PLC are now trying to fire network connections around the network looking for that PLC or that historian. So you're going to get a lot of effectively misconfigured equipment. And you may also find that someone's gone into the environment and configured Google's DNS server on all of the devices. So again, there's machines in this environment that are a little bit fragile, that are being asked to do things on the network that they shouldn't be doing. So highlighting that and being able to improve the efficiency of the network is another advantage that this platform can bring. But generating all of this data is great, but getting an understanding of what do we now do with it? So how are we going to break down this IT and OT silo? Do we use the same SOC? Do we push security alerts into the IT SOC. Maybe they're better placed to deal with malware than the OT engineers, and just have the OT engineers focus on the operational issues. What do we do with the data that we're generating around alerts, around asset inventory? Do we push that into a platform such as ServiceNow? Do we push information around trends into Power BI? Can we use that information to increase our visibility on how compliant we are to any regulations that we've got to adhere to as a company? So kind of back to the architecture piece, I guess. Really, this is a very high-level diagram that just shows, at the bottom here, we have networks with, my mouse isn't moving, sorry. We have networks with the PLCs and the HMIs connecting into a switch. So that's where we want to take the span. If you're going through that segmentation policy, maybe we can look at taking the span from different areas in the network. Every network is different. There is no one size fits all for this. We have some customers who deploy one large appliance in their environment. We have other customers that deploy a number of small appliances in their environment. But the important thing here is from the sensor at the bottom, there's a dotted line up to the IT/OT firewall. So this is the connection that goes into our OT DMZ. If that sensor needs to connect to the internet, it needs to go out through an environment that's secure. And we can push that through firewalls, we can push that through proxies. We have a list of the addresses that sensor will want to connect to within Azure. So you can further tighten this down while still having all of that data being pushed up into the cloud, so you can make use of it with the rest of the Azure stack. And backing all of this up is the threat expertise of Section 52. So this is a dedicated team of IoT and OT security researchers who are constantly looking to reverse engineer malware. There's a number of honeypots that Microsoft have out in the wild that are collecting data. They're almost tempting attackers to come and show us what they can do. But all of this information, all of this knowledge gets rolled up into a continuous stream of threat intelligence updates. Now, they're typically released once a month, but these contain things like new CVEs, new malicious DNS indicators of compromise, new malware variants, etc. So one example was the Log4j vulnerability. So it was less than 10 hours between that being announced or discovered and new threat intelligence being delivered. So if the sensors are cloud connected, they will get that threat intelligence update pretty much the second that it's released. So you're continuously keeping your security monitoring platforms up to date. And above all, because we're part of Microsoft, we've got access to Microsoft's threat graph. And this is around 24 trillion signals a day, and it's increasing. So having the ability to look at what's happening in the wider world and not just being focused on specific OT devices or IoT devices, because these attacks spread. So understanding the anatomy of an attack helps build those threat intelligence packages that make them a lot more useful to any device trying to protect any network environment. And you can see on the right hand side, and I think these links are going to be made available, but there's a number of zero-day attacks and zero-day vulnerabilities that have been reported to CISA by Section 52. And this is both as part of Microsoft and prior to the Microsoft acquisition. So this is really just reiterating the kind of information that we're seeing. And some of these numbers are quite ridiculous in terms of the number of emails analyzed, the number of authentication events, the number of URLs. And if you think about what kind of platforms Microsoft has, these are coming from no end of different environments. So we've got the Office 365 environment right the way through to things like GitHub, to the Xbox network, to the public Outlook environments. So all of this data is being collected. I mean, it's anonymized, but we get a good grasp of what kind of attacks are in the wild and what's being propagated at the moment. And finally, just a kind of quick list of the kind of customers that Microsoft have. Now, you notice the only one that's named is at the top, which is Microsoft. So we use the platform internally to protect the building management systems of the Azure data centers. But going through some of these, we're looking at pharmaceutical companies, we're looking at automotive, generic manufacturing, oil and gas, chemical, water plants. So anywhere that there is operational technology, that's a very good use case for the Defender for IoT platform. And now I'm going to pass back to Shane.
Paul, thanks. That's very interesting on the platform side of it. So here now we reached on the key takeaways that how we should see moving forward, right? So we recommend predominantly to our customers to build the strong OT and ICS cybersecurity governance policies, basically, and adhere to the regulatory compliances, because that's your very first steps. How do you want to go ahead, right? And what exactly you want to achieve out of that. So you must have that governance in place before we start anything out of it. Then moving, you can have a risk assessments. Yes, so risk assessment is very much helping yourself to know what is your current status of OT cybersecurity and where you want to achieve or where you want to go, right? So while you do this thing, definitely Defender for IoT and Wipro's cybersecurity risk assessment frame can be leveraged to perform the risk assessment on your plants or in your sites. So that's the another things that we should take as a next way. In terms of the awareness and the training, as I said, the skill is very much important. Whatever you spent on your technology, it doesn't matter, but how to use the technology is the main one, right? So that's the another aspect. So you must have the certifications aligned or the trainings aligned within OT cybersecurity, identify the gaps of existing team members and ask them to go for the trainings within the cybersecurity space. Defense in that mechanism, definitely the malware or the ransomware kind of attacks. How do you mitigate? And there is no single solution. As I said, there's no silver bullet, right? You must be having different controls that you should be implementing within your environment. And define the strategy. So main thing is that how do you have that strategy for yourself in defending those malware attacks predominantly. And finally, I would say you can have the integrated IT OT SOC defining the various use cases, because what we've seen is again example from our customers is that they have very good IT SOC, right? So what use case that you should be building from the OT cybersecurity perspective is the key one, right? And definitely the Microsoft Sentinel, as well as we do have our Cyber Fusion Center. From there, the operations can be managed, and the entire SOC management can be done for the OT's perspective. Yep. So these are the key takeaways I would say for this particular webinar, and I would stop it and give back to Prakash on Q&A.
Thanks, Sean and Paul, for the informative session. I got a few questions for you. Let me start with the first question to Sean. What are the best practices to get a comprehensive and continuous threat visibility in OT IoT environment?
Yeah, Prakash, that's a good question, Prakash. I would say here. So when we talk about the best practice, right? So definitely, sorry, when we talk about the best practices, definitely it starts with cyber hygiene, I would say. So cyber hygiene can be anything. Defining your policies perspective, you should be having the awareness within your team members and so forth, right? The next is that you must have any automated discovery tool to understand how many devices you have, what vulnerability it has, right? So those are the things that you need to, I would say, bring in within your OT environment. Having this tool again is not enough. We have come across many customers where they implemented, but what we have seen that every day there is a discovery of 20,000 new devices. What's the use of having this kind of tools, right? So you must have the refinement baseline about these tools, and you have to have the categorizations of the specific alerts incidents that is generated by this tool, right? To have a continuous visibility of your OT as well as the IT environment. And finally, I would say you must have the categorizations as well as review of your operations on the periodic basis. That would help you in improving the overall process of OT threat monitoring and the visibility aspects.
Thanks, Shyam, for the clarity. So I would like to ask this question to Paul.
Yeah.
Paul, can we do a third-party system integrations with the Defender for IoT? Example like ServiceNow and Firewall.
Yeah, absolutely. So from the sensor itself, we can integrate with a number of platforms. So obviously there is the integration with Azure, but absolutely we can go into ServiceNow. We can go into a number of the legacy SIEM platforms with a pointed integration. We can integrate with syslog servers just generically. And there's also an API on the platform as well. So if you've got another system that uses an API to ingest data, then absolutely you can enable the API interface on the sensor and on the central management console and pull that information in directly.
Okay, thanks, Paul. So the next question I got, probably Shyam, you may take this question. How do you see the cloud adoption in the OT environment?
So this is very good questions because OT industry is definitely actually scared about the cloud, but still industry 4.0 is what we've seen there's adoption happening, and there are customers, right? So they have gone through the programs for their transformation. So yes, so this transformation is happening, and there is adoptions. What we notice is predominantly from the predictive maintenance aspects of the data analytics. So that is the initial stage where they have moved up their MES kind of databases, okay, as well as considering the availability aspects. So a couple of applications they have migrated securely, but however there is still to happen from the cybersecurity space in terms of implementing the proper controls for the cloud environment. Yeah, so adoption is there, Prakash, right? So, but the cybersecurity aspect is what something the customer has to look into it.
So thanks for the insight, Shyam. With that, I would like to hand over to Paulette for the closer notes. Thanks, everyone. Paulette, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shyam and Paul, for a great presentation, and Prakash for moderating. We do value your feedback. We have a short survey in the chat window for you to fill out for us. And with that, we do conclude our webinar today. Again, thank you so much for joining. We'll share out the recording and the presentation deck in about a week or so. I'll let the speakers say goodbye. And again, thanks for joining. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.